objective and a language objective in all of our classes. The content is tied to the subject area. The language is what they can learn about language this day in this lesson. They might be learning how to write a comparative essay. They might be learning how to argue with someone. They might just be learning how to use the past tense of a verb. It really varies by the lesson, but there's a language goal along with a subject area goal. And I just wanted to share with you, this was a first grade classroom in Connecticut. And the students were studying the fall or autumn. And what the teacher did is she had a content and a language objective for this lesson. The content objective said students will be able to identify things to do, see, and smell in the fall. Okay, we're talking about 6-year-olds. And the language was they'll be able to discuss and write about the topic fall with supporting details. So really narrowing it down sort of, or focusing in on the academic skill, writing with supporting details. But how do you write as a first grader? Right? There's a lot of inventive spelling, obviously. We take this back off, but so they're learning to draw some pictures, right? And that's how they get their supporting details. They're drawing pictures about the fall, but the pictures are also, tapping into identify things to do, see, and spell in the fall. And then they're doing the writing, and they're writing things. I can just read this to you. You can go trick-or-treating, which is a Halloween celebration in the US. You can see the trees, and you can smell apple pie, I think is what it is. It's a common thing that we have in the US. So those kinds of things, the kids know from their objectives what their goal is for the day. And they know what their language goal and their content goal should be. So they also then, if the teacher presents this at the beginning of the lesson, they can start, even as first graders, taking responsibility for their learning, which is really what we want, because we have to engage them in that learning as well. If you're working with adults, and here's an example from the adult education book, what might be a content objective? Well, they're working on survival skills in this particular class, and they're trying to get jobs, right? Because many of the adult refugees and immigrants in the US, they've got to get jobs right away. So I can handle money transactions. So they're learning about money. They're learning denominations of money, making change, all those kinds of things. But what's a language goal that could go along with this? Maybe I'm learning to count change. And you know how you give back. Do you still use a euro, 1 euro, 2 euro, that kind of thing, right? Or I can respond to questions about forms of payment. So we're getting into that language function of asking, answering questions. Or I can scan information as a reading process to look for missing information. Or I can write a receipt. So just from this content objective of learning to deal with money, here are different things that I can do from a language perspective. What else do we have to do? We have to really balance the teacher talk and the student talk. As I always say, it's not me that needs practice speaking, but here I am up here speaking for all of you. We've got to turn as much as possible to ways that we get our students talking in the classroom. Working together is one way to do that. How else do we improve the language development? We have a variety of materials, and we show videos. One of the key things, I don't know how many of you show videos in your lessons. Obviously, right? Do you ever show it with the sound off first? Yeah. I mean, that's a great way to have them start to engage and get a sense of what's going on, and then build and use it as an inquiry approach, not only to the content, but to the language, because then you can introduce them to some key vocabulary after they've already had some background built with the visuals. And then when you play it with the sound, they have the words that they're going to be looking for, as well as the other information that they share. I don't know how it is, but in the US, when I went to school and we would study Shakespeare, right, we would read the entire book, the whole play. It would take a month lots of times, right? Especially the first few years you're introduced to Shakespeare. And then at the end, they would show us the movie. I always think flip it. Show the movie first. Get that background activated. Have them understand what's happening, then go in and really enjoy the language. Vocabulary development, obviously, key thing. And again, What vocabulary do your students need? That aviation English student doesn't need the same vocabulary that a CLIL chemistry student needs. Those are the kinds of things we always have to think about. And really some of the work too is not only to have subject-specific language, but general academic words, right? So words that we can use in any subject area, but also the words that we would use in writing and that we see in reading, connecting ideas. Words like result, describe, circumstance, locate. All of those kinds of words are very common across the curriculum. Finding ways to make our input comprehensible. We saw that was an essential condition for language learning. I love, this is from that same Connecticut elementary school. And they were trying to teach about text features. So we've got types of print, bold and italic and capital, headings, labels, graphics. And they just took a newspaper and, as you can see, cut out the circles to highlight the pieces that they wanted the kids to learn. So it makes the input comprehensible. And then we also have these charts, all these different ways that we make input comprehensible, whether we're talking about the talk that a teacher would use, the text that's being used, or other kinds of activities and strategies. Sometimes we're affecting the context, we're simplifying sometimes the language that's in the materials, and then sometimes we're elaborating because we have to give more information. Sometimes we're doing comprehension checks. These are all the different ways that or not only, these are a number of the different ways that we can help promote comprehensible input. Having oral language practice that taps in. Obviously, we want our students to be speaking more to themselves, to their, no, we don't want them speaking more to themselves, sorry. to their classmates, to their peers. I think I need a sip of water here. We do a lot of self-talk, like where did I put the keys? But right, the car keys. But really, this is an important part of all language development because we know that when we start with oral language, we can build reading, we can build writing. But we can start with oral language and then write. We don't have to read first. We can read and then we can talk about what we've read. But it's very synergetic to have all of these language domains working together. I showed you that anchor chart earlier. Here's another one that was from a classroom. The teacher was working on how do you grow a conversation? How do you get students to elaborate? They're working in small groups. How do you get them to share ideas, build on others' ideas? What are some phrases that you can use? So I agree with this because, or I agree with this but, right? So sort of have a little shift there, and there's a distinction between those things. Where else do we want to go? Principle 4 is the art of teaching. I think it's the art and science of teaching. Because if something's not working, what are you going to do? You're not just going to go on and on and on if your students are all crying, or if they're all looking out the window because obviously you haven't gained their attention, or if they all fail the test. You have to do some things that are different. So some of the things are looking at, obviously, checking their comprehension. We just talked about that earlier. But adjusting what we do. And what are some of the ways that we adjust this? I want you to think for 30 seconds. What's one way that you adjust when the lesson isn't going the way you planned? All right. How many of you talked about adapting the content or finding different materials? Anybody? Okay. How many about doing more scaffolding, more support for the language or the task that you want them to do? Differentiating the instruction. So some students might do one task, another might do another. Do you work on your pacing? Maybe you're just going too quickly, right? Or do you reteach? All of these are ways that we do that, obviously. So when we're working with writing, we might use scaffolds, right? Different writing scaffolds depending on the type of writing that we're asking the students to do. These writing scaffolds are also reading scaffolds. As they're reading, they can be recording information using these scaffolds to gather and to take notes. Maybe you're differentiating the task. This is such a straightforward kind of grammar task, but it's kind of fun. It's easy to show. You've got a bunch of nouns, verbs, and prepositions. Well, maybe your students who are at a lower ability level, all they have to do is make a sentence with one noun and one verb. They have choice, right, which is good because we all appreciate choice. But in our second group, slightly higher, have to use the noun, the verb, and the preposition. Okay? Make a sentence, maybe make 2 sentences. Our highest group has to make a sentence using something from each column, but they have to make it in the past tense. Not that hard, but as a teacher, you prepare this chart. You don't have to do a lot more preparation. You just have to decide what are the different tasks that are being used. So, it can be fun, and then obviously, a student who's in group 1 could certainly try and do group 2's activity or group 3's. There's nothing to stop that from happening. What happens with Principle 5? So this assessment also comes in with monitoring errors and also with giving feedback and actually having those kinds of assessments that we can do in the classroom. And obviously, if we're lucky, our assessments will support student learning. They're not gotchas, right? They're really, what do we know? What do you know? What have you made progress on? And then what can I do next to push you and advance your learning a little bit more? When it comes to feedback, though, we have to think a little bit sometimes about our learners. And this is another thing that back in Principle 1, Know Your Learners, you have to say, okay, what kind of feedback are they comfortable with? There are some that want corrective feedback right away. Right away. There are many others who say, find another way to tell me that privately, or do a mini lesson the next day. If you see, a bunch of us have made the same mistake. So there can be those explicit corrections. Teachers frequently will recast, especially if a student makes a mistake saying something orally. The teacher might paraphrase it or restate it using appropriate English. That's a very common tool. When we might prompt them for repairing themselves. And when I was teaching in the Peace Corps in the Congo, I was very young, and I was, not an experienced teacher, but the thing that used to drive me crazy was the third person singular S, right? And so I just would always show 3 fingers to the students. Remember, you put the S on, kind of thing. But that was my nonverbal cue. And looking at work over time, I wanted to share this with you because this was a student, how he was doing a research report in October. He was fairly new to doing research. I think he was a 3rd or 4th grader. And he was supposed to research what happens during an earthquake. Right? So he has his questions on the left side, and he was just writing his notes on the right side. That was his research report then. And then in May, he did a different research report. This was on an animal. And you can see that he's gone from just writing simple sentences in response to questions to crafting a paragraph. And I just have to read a part of this to you because it's about a leopard. One animal I know a lot about is a leopard. Its natural habitat is the desert. Not sure about that. But you'll recognize the leopard by its tan skin. It also has black spots. Pretty, simple sentences, but he's getting a lot of information there. A leopard eats warthogs, baboons, or an antelope. Important information, especially if you have any of those pets in your house right now. But I love this. So the most interesting fact is a female leopard gives birth to 2. Did you know that? No, neither did I. So another thing that you've learned in today's session, dynamic bilingualisms and leopards have twins. All right. What else do we do informally? How many of you do exit tickets? You should start doing exit tickets. At the end of a lesson, what did you learn today? Or look back at the objectives. Tell me one thing you did today that helped you meet that objective. Or what's one thing that you would like to see on a quiz tomorrow? Anything that helps them wrap up their information. The pass the note card. Exit ticket gives to the teacher. Pass the note card is you take that exit ticket, you have the students just pass it around the room, and then you call stop and they read somebody else's response. So you hear these orally. You have to tell them to write legibly, though. Writing a headline, right? What would be the newspaper headline for today's session? They have to summarize, they have to use creative language if it's a good headline. We're not talking the New York Post here, but a good headline. You must have an equivalent here in Rome, a newspaper that does that. Online games and online ways of assessing learning. Wow, wonder, or what if? Do you know that one? It's just a little chart. And what I like about it is it provides some critical thinking. So students may have read a story or an article, or they've watched a video. What's a wow they had? What do they wonder? Can they come up with a what if? What if the person did this instead? What if the character didn't go to Verona or anything like that? And you can just have put it on little Post-its, and you keep this chart in your room, and they come up and they put the Post-its up there. But what a great way, instead of just answering recall kind of questions, they're really thinking more deeply. And then another one are whiteboards. I don't know if you use a lot of whiteboards here. Just sort of wipe on and wipe off. You write on them and you can wipe them off these boards. And teachers can ask a question and the students write and they show it to the teacher. It makes it very easy. You can scan the room to see if the students understand what you've talked about. Okay. So principle 6, this is our final principle. What are we doing in terms of collaborating and working with one another, trying to become better? We engage with our profession. We think about ourselves critically too as educators, right? And we also work in community partnerships. So within the 6 principles books, we just have an assessment checklist, self-assessment. You can see, am I doing these things? You know, and if I'm not, maybe I look through the chapter and say, oh, now that's another way I could do that, or I could add this to my professional repertoire. How else do you engage and collaborate? How many of you have ever done a book study? Right? Okay. Maybe you have a professional learning community. You have one, obviously, right here. Any of you part of TESOL International? Do you belong to the My TESOL groups and the listservs there? And even if you don't, the My TESOL Lounge is free to non-members as well, so you can join. Are you a resource to your colleagues? I'm sure everybody in this room is, right? Do you do curriculum planning? Of course. Yeah. And how about, have you ever gone to TESOL's Teacher Resource Center? There's a wonderful website, on the TESOL International website. We have lots of lesson plans and curriculum guides and other kinds of things that are available. This is a great way to collaborate and right? And engage with one another. You've come here to the conference, and I think it's delightful. In turn, I'd like to invite you to TESOL International's conference next March, which will be in Denver. There's a lot of resources there for you. And I just want to conclude with one of my... Sorry. The6principles.org. And I'd like to conclude with just one favorite quote. That the education is not the filling of the pail, but the lighting of the fire.